Awesome. All right. Yeah, as Chris mentioned, I am a visual artist here in Alaska, and I specialize in painting and drawing outside in remote places all throughout the state, but also I work in the studio as well. So I like to say that I'm a place-based artist. I guess a little bit about my background. I was born and raised here in Fairbanks. I like to joke that I haven't gone very far in life because I live just across the road from my parents where I was born. So I feel very tied to this place, the Boreal Forest. It's been my home my whole life. And today I wanted to share, yeah, just a little bit more about my process, the evolution of how I started to paint outside, materials that I like to use. And then I'm actually going to share about four recent projects that I've been working on in the last couple of years. So let's get into it. I grew up in a family that spent a lot of time outside. My mom and dad were just both really supportive of, my brother and I playing outside and in the dirt, in the woods, on the rivers, hiking, camping. We spent a lot of time in tents, both in summer and winter. And so I think these threads of combining the arts and the outdoors started very early for me. So thank you, mom and dad. That's actually a pile of markers that I used to carry around in my backpack as a kid. So I think, just this speaks to that really early support from both of my parents. So I'm very grateful to them for that. So jumping forward about 15 years, I attended the University of Alaska Fairbanks for art school. I actually studied printmaking and woodblock carving at first, but then I took a class from Igor Pasternak later on in my degree, and I found that I really liked the expression of painting. So that early work was very landscape based and very focused on how the outdoors have shaped my own identity. It felt like very personal. It was very much about who I am and how I experience these places. I graduated in 2012 and I started this messy process of figuring out how to piece together an income and manage my time and, sort of the reality hit of what it means to be a self-employed artist. And I think it's just important to note that when I put presentations like this together, I think we have the benefit of looking back and making it seem like a straight track, but I just want to say I feel like I've had a very wiggly path and I've really followed my nose and I continue to. So don't let the presentation fool you. It wasn't that straight of a line, but um, along with art making, skiing is the other way that I have always found connection with the outdoors, how I've expressed creativity and found flow. And for a long time, I actually considered working in the ski industry. And so right after graduation, I was trying to figure out who I am, how can I build a life around these places and these activities, skiing and making art that I love so much. And just trying out many different things. So this is actually a very abstract piece that this painting on the right here that you can see is an interpretation of the landscape of the mountains through the lens of a skier. So that abstraction is really showing the flow and blending of these mountain forms, and it's trying to speak to the sensation of skiing a steep line. Shortly after school, I settled into a rhythm of working as a guide for a company called Arctic Wild and teaching for an organization called Inspiring Girls Expeditions, both based here in Fairbanks. And that was a great seasonal lifestyle choice. I still do this to this day. It's a great way to support a winter of making art. And on those early trips to the Arctic, I naturally started to sketch outside because this is just making art is just how I best process the world around me. It's how I record memories. It's the way my brain thinks. Like many of you, we all have different learning styles, and I think art has just always, or visuals have always been the way that I learn best. Um, I think it was the summer after graduation, or maybe it was 2 summers after graduation. Between guiding trips, I took a 3-day class from an artist, a painter here in Fairbanks, David Mollett, out on the Yukon River. This was the very first time I painted outside. That's what the class was about. And this was just like one of those huge aha moments in my life. It was like oh, this is what I'm meant to be doing. This is a very clear um, this feels right. And you can see in this on the in the picture on the left here, there's like a garbage bag. It was raining. I was in the silt in the mud, and I was just having the time of my life making this painting because it was this moment where now it wasn't about me and it became not about my memory or not about my personal experience, but more about this process of like uh, immersion in place. And I was able to start directly listening and responding to the place. So it felt like a real conversation was taking place. It was an immediate conversation with the place. It also solved a great problem of not having a physical studio space. So it was like, oh, I can paint outside and I don't have to paint out of the back of my car or, in my parents' furnace room. So it was a really big moment for me to paint outside for that first time, and I really ran with it. Um, I think some of that abstraction was still present in these really simplified shapes. This is up north in the Brooks Range on the Saugatuck River, and yeah, what is there to say about this? I think painting outside really, like, part of that transformation from working in the studio to painting outside, it allowed me to start seeing the landscape as movement, and I see movement everywhere in the landscape. And so um, I think that this is the common thread throughout all of my work from this point forward. Um, I'm still using, oh, it's important to point out, I'm still using acrylics at this time. So acrylic painting works really great in the studio, but once you're outside, then you have a whole mess of water that you're dipping your brushes into to rinse it off. And so I was trying to figure out, well, shoot, do I carry that water around in my backpack in a water bottle? It doesn't feel right to dump this out in the tundra. So I was developing systems and ways to deal with that, but it was kind of tricky. You kind of need a lot of water to paint with acrylic. And it is hard to clean brushes responsibly outside. I was still going on a lot of solo trips at this time, primarily in the summer to paint. These are just day trips, single day outings. And I was just starting to seek new ways of knowing and listening. So I really started to ask myself, what am I trying to do with my art? What does my work communicate? How can I learn more about the land and its long legacies? And what does it mean to be in good relations with this place? I get so much from these places, and how can I reciprocate that? And here in this painting, I was trying to show again that movement, how gravity is inherently expressed in the land. And so this was kind of the progression. I I consider myself every time I see this image, I get happy because this is the first time I painted on a glacier outside in the winter. And this is probably like the second aha moment of my life. I very much consider myself to be a winter person. So after a few summers of learning how to paint outside, it was this really inevitable step to try and paint outside in the winter. At first, I was just painting directly on the snow, and then I actually started to carry stretch canvas. You can see on the right here. Um, so that's actually like a framed canvas. There's a wood stretcher bar, and the canvas is stretched around the wood. So there's a physical frame. And I designed the dimensions actually to fit in my friend's snowboard rack there. So that's on the back of a snow machine or a snowmobile. And still going on day trips, skiing was still the main goal here. But I would come home with a painting that was about, maybe 10, 25% complete. So I'm still dipping my toes in and learning. This was also the time that I made, these are paintings from that same time period where I was figuring out how to paint outside in the winter. This is when I switched to using oil paint. I found that oil paint doesn't freeze like acrylic. Acrylic is water-based. Oil, I use just basically a safflower oil. And I started to work in really thin layers. And actually that paint, that oil paint that we all kind of know in our minds to be very wet, it can actually dry in a matter of hours if it's pretty thin, or dry just enough that it's not going to come off the canvas. So I also found that it was much easier to contain and not contaminate the surroundings by using oil paint because, acrylic is a microplastic. I wasn't wanting to dump water in the landscape. And so with oil, I actually am able to carry everything out with me. And I don't need a whole lot of solvent or anything to do this. So yeah, I think it was at this point maybe in 2016, 2017, I realized this is what I really wanted to do with my life. And so I really started to intentionally plan ahead and develop systems and my gear, like all my outdoor gear, for the purpose of painting outside in these remote places. So 99% of the places I paint are fully off trail. They require remote travel, route finding, and I access these places. So the map here is showing just some of the places I've been lucky enough to paint outside in Alaska. And Alaska is very big and it has a very limited road system. So there aren't a ton of roads in Alaska. And so sometimes I will drive and then start to ski or hike or float from the road. Sometimes I have the assistance of a bush plane, which is another common way of getting around in Alaska. That's a little more rare because it's expensive. But that's how I'm getting to these places. And I think as nice as it was to have access to a snow machine early in that process, I'm much more interested in human powered travel and how, as a skier moving through the landscape, what does that tell me about the snowpack? What does that tell me about, the shifting perspective as I move slowly through a valley? I think that all of those things feed into the painting at the end, as opposed to just sort of flying from a great height or, moving really fast on a snow machine. So it's really important to me to have that feel of the place. And so it's not just about the painting, it's about getting there. And as I lean into developing these gear systems for the purpose of art making, I really started to have this goal to pare it all down into one backpack for, short or multi-night trips. Some of these trips where I go painting, they might be up to 2 weeks. So it just depends on the place, the time I have, all of that. But I thought it would be nice to get it all into one backpack, which really meant that the painting had to travel rolled. So that's what you can see here is the canvas or the painting rolled up, ready for transport, in and out. And on the right, this was one of the first times that picture on the right, one of the first times I went out, I guess with a rolled canvas, it must have been. I failed to consider that it might rain on the canvas, and so I had to bust out my tent tarp partway through this hike on the glacier because it was pouring down rain. And so I think that that's part of the fun of improvising and figuring it out and developing these systems. But it's I learn something new every time I go out. I definitely don't have it all figured out. So the thing about having a rolled canvas is that I actually also then need what's called a stretcher bar system. So stretcher bars just refer to the wood frame that basically supports the canvas or the linen that you're painting on. So here you can see what I worked out, which is basically these wooden stretcher bars that I can disassemble. I seal them in the studio ahead of time, so they're mostly waterproof. And then once I get to the place where I'm going to paint, I assemble the frame. I attach a linen canvas using a plastic staple gun. I was so excited when I found a plastic staple gun because I had been carrying around I don't know, felt like a 5 pound metal, giant staple gun in my backpack. So I use a plastic staple gun and then I just reverse that process to carry it out. Once the painting is dry enough, I can actually just pull the canvas off using a Leatherman, and I keep track of every staple, pack it in, pack it out, and so that's how that works. At most, I'm bringing about 6 brushes. I really like a stiff brush because, as I mentioned, I work in these really thin layers and I don't like to use a lot of mediums or solvents. And so a stiff brush basically allows me to push around the paint on the canvas and make it work it really thin so that it can dry fast enough. I have also worked to reduce my palette to about 8 colors. That's what you see there in the center. Sometimes if I know that I only have a day or two to work on a painting, I might just bring 3 or 4 colors and I do what's called an underpainting. So it's a very simplified painting, but I really prefer to try and finish paintings on location. So that's, I guess I've worked more towards that in the past few years, but. And oh, on the right here, that's a peek into my jacket, my wool vest. So one of the things about painting in winter, obviously, is that it is cold. It's below freezing. And so although oil paint doesn't freeze, it will get very stiff. And so I just do what I would do on a normal winter camping trip, and I keep those paints in my pockets. So that's just a view of how I keep the paint warm. I'll tell you, it's always fun when you crash on skis with paint in your pockets. I've never had one explode, but I've had paint explode in my backpack. So I should point out in that middle picture, that's actually a dry bag. So yeah, that was not a fun trip when I had a blue paint tube totally explode over all my gear in my backpack. So I try to avoid that, but so let's get into some recent projects. As I mentioned, Alaska is a really big place. So as I was putting together this presentation, I thought it'd be fun to pull some projects that are from four very different places in Alaska. There's a lot of different ecosystems here. And so this is kind of a way for us to jump around and maybe see some different places in Alaska. So our first stop is the heart of the Alaska Range at Denali Base Camp on the Kahiltna Glacier. I first met these two here, Rachel and Rose, in the photos. I met them online during the pandemic in 2020, and we just quickly connected and realized we had this shared passion for communicating specifically about glacial environments through art, science, and firsthand experiences. And so we came up with the idea for what we called creative approach as a way to basically create the artist residency of our dreams. I think we had all been applying to residencies and looking for opportunities in the arts and not finding quite what we were looking for. And so we're like, well, let's do it ourselves. Let's put our own limited resources towards the thing we keep talking about doing. And so the idea was quite simple. It was just that we were going to fly into base camp, Denali Base Camp. We were going to make art and push ourselves and each other and support each other in our respective disciplines. So Rachel's a filmmaker and photographer. Rose is an artist and pastry chef. She's making a baked Alaska there in that photo, which I think is great. And we wanted to do this in a very social but remote place, right? Like Denali Base Camp is quite a social place, but it's out there. And we chose base camp for practical and social reasons. There was the cost to consider, the skill sets of our team. Rachel was new to winter camping, so she was doing a lot of learning, which was awesome. And Rose had this great vision to create a 4-tier wedding cake for the climbers. So, and then actually serve it to the climbers there at camp. So, and Rachel was also very interested in the human story of why do we go outside? Why do we go to the mountains? So those are some of the reasons we decided to go to base camp. But one of the big reasons we went is that I am obsessed with the North Buttress of Baguia, of this mountain, which is in the picture on the right. I couldn't see it when we got there. I couldn't see it for a lot of days that we were there, but I've been honestly pretty obsessed with painting this one peak. I usually don't, know what I'm going to paint until I get there and I paint it. But this peak I have wanted to paint for years. So that was my goal. I wanted to make a really big painting of Baguia. And after a weather day, we flew into base camp where we were going to stay for about 10 to 12 days. And I wanted to share this project too because I think it's a good example of how I build a snow studio to paint outside in the winter. So I couldn't see the mountain, so I figured I'd make a pretty awesome snow pit. That's what I could do in the meantime, is I could build the studio. So you can see how I dig out the platforms, platform for the painting. There's a place where I can sit and stand. There's little stairs that go down into that trench. And then I use what are called snow anchors for basically guying out and supporting the canvas, and also a tarp over the canvas. And I love snow. It's just you can do so many different things with snow. It's like the best studio to work in. I think it looks way more extreme than it is. It's quite cozy. It's quite comfortable. When you need a shelf, you just dig a shelf. If you need to sit somewhere, you just dig a seat. Or you put more snow there and you can just basically form this little mini world. So it's a really fun way of making a painting. And I think it also goes to show that those early winter camping skills, I think, have really translated well into my art practice, combining these, the ability to set up a really strong tarp um, to make food under translates very well to setting up a very strong tarp to paint under. So I was peeking out of our sleeping tent at all hours to see if I could see the North Buttress. The first few days we really couldn't see it. This is the first best view after 4 days of snow, and I think it shows on the right here how strong that tarp and canvas really are. We had about a foot of snow overnight, and the painting was perfectly fine. There was no snow on it, and I was able to get in there and dig it out and get to work because I could finally see Baguia. So as those days progressed, we had mixed weather, and I would just work on the painting when I could see what I was trying to paint. And I think this is also a good example of um, how I sort of build the bones of the landscape. It's almost a drawing before it's a painting. So I'm using charcoal, vine charcoal, or just thin layers of paint to sort of build the bones of the landscape. And then I can come in and add snow and rock and shadow. And I actually paint my skies last, which is kind of counterintuitive. Usually you work from the back forwards, but I like to wait to the end to sort of capture the light and sense of the place. And I'll also point out here too, I'm always trying to figure out better ways to just be responsible with the fact that I do have oil paint out. I don't often drip paint, but occasionally I do. So there's this orange tarp that you can see, and I've set it up now so that with my system, I have this little drip edge. So if I do have an accident of some kind, I'm catching the paint. We were down in the main base camp. We kind of camped up on a hill just above the main base camp because it is kind of a hustling and bustling place. And we were down kind of socializing in base camp when it just suddenly went gorgeous sky blue one day. I hadn't been able to see Baguia for a number of days at this point, and the clouds parted and it just went totally glorious, I think on like day 8 or 9. And so this was the most work I did on the painting the whole time I was there. Um, I knew weather was going to be a factor, but maybe I'm an optimistic person. I thought I was going to make 3 paintings of this size in 10 days, and I only made one. So that was a lesson. Um, but because of that glorious day, I was able to get this painting probably about 95% complete there on location. And it is a 4 foot by 6.5 foot painting, and that is the largest that I've painted on location. And I created some special reusable stretcher bars for this trip so that I can continue to paint at this size outside because it just feels right. When you're in really big places, you want a really big canvas. All right, let's go. Where are we going now? We're going really far north now. We're going above the Arctic Circle into the Central Brooks Range um, to the edge of tree lines. So, as I mentioned maybe previously, I'm interested in these different ways of combining art and science, these different ways of knowing. And in 2021, I was invited by Roman Dial and Bill Brody as a part of this team, like a multi-generational team of scientists and artists who were revisiting timberline research that a guy called David Cooper, who was also on the trip, had started there in the late 1970s. So this 2-week trip that I was a part of was just one small piece of a bigger traverse that Roman was working on, I think over about 3 or 4 years. So I just have one small piece in this, but I was there to help carry gear, to listen and learn from those around me, and to help build those connections with people in place through art. And I think the Inupiat perfectly named this place thousands of years ago. It's called the Aragetch. I don't know if I mentioned that, but the Aragetch in Inuit means fingers of the outstretched hand. And and although I was there to help study trees, if there is a glacier, even if it is small and mostly rock covered, you can always depend on me to paint the glacier. So this was the first painting I made there. I just couldn't help myself. Um, and I guess I should mention there were tiny little spruce saplings sprinkled in the landscape around me. So there are little spruce saplings here in this painting in the foreground. But I think just like a repeat photo, this painting is intended to be a baseline for showing what this place looks like. But I think unlike a repeat photo, hopefully it also translates something about the feel of this place, the movement of this place, the emotion of sitting in this place, as it was in 2021. So a little bit more about the science. This is just showing this progression from left to right, just is showing our hike up the valley, up the Aragetch Valley, thicker trees starting to get a little bit thinner and smaller, and then very small trees, saplings, where I made that first painting. And this is probably familiar to a lot of us who have walked through dense trees into the high alpine, up into the mountains. Um, and so those changes that we often associate with elevation change are also being seen in the Arctic as trees are moving from the south to the north. So trees are moving into the Arctic with climate change. And this is seen through firsthand observations, through data. And this change isn't just because of warming seasonal temperatures, it's connected to a variety of different things, including the disappearance of sea ice in the Arctic Ocean, which has led to different weather patterns, deeper snowpacks. And so these conditions all contribute to these little spruce trees being able to survive, thrive, get thicker, taller, and grow higher up in the mountains and even further north. So this is part of what we're seeing, the borealization. I don't even know if that's a word. The borealification. We're seeing trees move north. There's got to be some fancy science word for that. A major highlight of this trip was connecting with Julia Ditto, who integrates art and science, and she really showed me that I rely on art as a gateway into scientific thinking. I think there are details from the landscape that take on new meaning as I sit there and contemplate color and space and patterns and the relationship between all these things. And I think that wonder leads to curiosity, leads to critical thinking, leads to creative experimentation. And painting is a way for me to hold space for this process. This is a third painting I made on the trip. And on the right is a collection of studies and notes about the mountain heather plant that really dominated the foreground in the painting to the left. So this is just the underpainting here. And I was inspired by the scientists. So I went as far as to count the number of nodes and, the leaves on this mountain heather plant. I guess I don't even know if they're technically called leaves. But the little flowers and the forms and the shapes that I was observing. And as I was painting this piece, David, Forrest, and Ben actually methodically worked their way up the hill right next to where I was painting, and they're doing a transect, and they're looking at the prevalence and size of these little young spruce saplings, these tiny, tiny little spruce saplings all throughout the tundra here. And later on back in camp, David mentioned that the stump that I was so visually intrigued in was likely he called it a parent tree to the more mature trees in our surroundings. So it was like probably one of the first trees to be there. And this revelation, just that simple comment allowed me to suddenly reimagine what this place might have looked like 40 years ago when David was working there, and therefore what it might look 40 years in the future. And so I named the painting Grandmother Tree. And, as a visual communicator, making art is not just how I form memory, but it's how I better share the story of a specific location. So it's important to me. It's really a privilege to get to talk about these experiences because I think that they go hand in hand with the paintings. Hopefully the painting tells the story as well, but one of my goals as an artist is to really provide a foothold for people to see places that you might not get to see otherwise and to feel connected to it. All right, let's travel south now for a coastal perspective. We're in South Central Alaska for this one. In 2022, I was lucky to participate in a program called Voices of the Wilderness. It's a really unique artist in residence program hosted by federal agencies, all different federal agencies throughout Alaska, actually cooperating to support, I think it's like 10 to 12 artists every summer to provide access to wilderness areas for artists. And there's this emphasis on stewardship activities, education, and outreach. So my role as an artist is to help in those activities. So Along with two wilderness rangers, I was able to spend 10 days boating, kayaking, and camping in places all throughout Nelly One College Fjord Wilderness Study area. And I was really interested in visiting this place because I live in the center of the state. I live in interior Alaska, deep in the boreal forest, and I have very little experience with the coasts. Um, and as we all know, oceans and coastal ecosystems are changing significantly with climate. And so, from the perspective, like as an example, from the perspective of this painting, you can see just in the very distance there a tiny little glacier. Well, it's not a tiny glacier, it's tiny in the photo. Um, the Nelly Glacier. And everywhere where you see water in this photo, that lagoon, that nice, gorgeous teal slice of water, that represents where the glacier used to be as recently as the 1930s, or about 90 years ago. So you can tell this big glacier is getting smaller. And I selected this view as a way to highlight that dramatic change. And so this painting was called Where the Glacier Was. And I what to say about it? I guess this painting was oddly difficult to make. It seems like a pretty happy painting, but I was feeling pretty sad and daunted painting it. And I think that that's one of the things that hopefully art can do, not just for me in the act of painting it, but for all of us, is to sort of cope with those feelings that we have very naturally when we think about really big, complex problems like climate change. And so I hope with this piece, I decided that where do I see hope in this place? And I really just started to focus on those western hemlocks and those trees that are just so obviously battered and weathered and just still thriving in this really difficult environment. And of course, western hemlocks move in; they're part of the post-glacial landscape. And so, uh, at any rate, whatever that's worth, there's that little bit of hope. So. As an interior Alaskan, as I mentioned, the cycles of tides were totally new to me. I mean, I had some concept that there were tides, but I had no firsthand experience with it. And so they were a really fun learning curve on this trip. So I set up this painting because I wanted to paint this iceberg. And when I set up a painting, I'm pretty tuned in. I'm paying attention to the conditions, to the prevailing winds, to how the light is shifting. I'm looking at, what do the clouds say about incoming weather? And I totally forgot to consider the tide or the rising tide in this case. And, pretty quickly I realized what was happening because my boots were starting to sink in and like the ground was getting mucky beneath me. And I realized the water was coming in. And it gave this really fun sense of urgency to the mark making. And I think that it just was a really good reminder that creativity is all about adapting to what's happening around us. And I think that creativity is a way to in whatever form, not just painting, but any way that we can be creative makes us more adaptable. It's like flexing a muscle. It's like stretching before exercise. I think that those things are very connected. This is another painting from that trip. And gosh, this was just such a fun day. All these paintings are like little memory palaces. I have like notes of what I wanted to say, and then I'm just like, I should just talk about the experience of sitting on this little island in the middle of the ocean by myself. They dropped me off here on my own, and I just had the whole day to paint. I mean, that's just like so magical. It's beyond me. Um, so yeah, I guess one of the other things I wanted to emphasize is that painting outside has taught me to be curious. And in simple terms, curiosity just means there's something you don't know that you want to know more about. And that can be really, really big. Like it can be, is this island going to be here in 100 more years? Like, is the sea going to rise and this island will be gone? Or it can be tiny. Like I just was so enamored with the curve of this beach. And so I was asking myself, how can I visually represent that beautiful curve? It's just, I'm curious. How can I do that? I'm going to try to do that. And sometimes that curiosity is satisfied, but I think more often than not, curiosity just leads to more questions and threads to pull at. And that's like one of the most addictive and wonderful feelings. I think that curiosity is an antidote to uncertainty. And we certainly have a lot of uncertainty in the world right now. And so I think that any way you can be curious in the world is a good thing. And I don't think I quite got the curve of that beach right, but by sitting there all day painting, I got to know it on a more personal level and just get a little bit closer to understanding these ancient processes that shaped this place, and that shape it. It's an active process, right? Change is always happening. As you can see in the sky, I watched this gorgeous storm just move past in the background. It was really incredible experience. So the last project that I want to share is part of a much bigger initiative. I guess let's back up. Now we're in the center of the state, the boreal forest, right in the heart of the boreal forest, my home and my love. And this project is part of a program called In a Time of Change, which is hosted by the University of Alaska Fairbanks and Bonanza Creek LTER, which is a long-term ecological research. So it's a science organization. And In a Time of Change facilitates and produces these events focused on social ecological themes. And they've hosted I don't know, maybe between 5 and 8 programs since 2008. One of the most recent programs was called Boreal Forest Stories, and it brought together a large cohort of artists, writers, and scientists to create narrative work about the boreal forest. And it was through this program that I first met author Debbie Modrow and reconnected with my friend in college, and she's also an ecologist, Becky Hewitt. And through Boreal Forest Stories, Debbie and I worked on 2 projects where we had conversations with each other by exchanging words and paintings. So Debbie's a writer, I'm a painter. So she would send me words, I would send a painting in reply, and so on and so forth. So this was the second project that we made together for that program. And it's inspired by what we learned from researchers who were looking at wildfire and permafrost in the boreal forest. And the paintings here depict a recently burned tree from a very recent wildfire and a weathered tree that likely burned about 100 years ago. And the layered landscapes behind each tree show these different boreal processes interacting through time. So the idea was to show that these 2 trees are very shaped by their surroundings. We created this work right at the end of the Boreal Forest Stories program, but we could just tell that there was something, Debbie and I could just really tell there was something more that we wanted to explore that was, we wanted to speak to that deeper interconnectivity of the forest. So we decided to do our own projects, sort of an outgrowth of Boreal Forest Stories. And this is work that we started in 2022, and we're actually very actively, I'm finishing paintings next week. It's very current work. So this is Debbie and Becky and myself. We met in person in the fall of 2022, right at the end of that Boreal Forest Stories program. And we spent time together walking through black spruce that are experiencing a historic beetle outbreak that is moving north in the Alaska Range. And we talked about spruce beetles, bumblebees, berries, trees, woodpeckers, these key pieces of a collaborative narrative of the forest. I'm still learning how to talk about this project. I'm still so in it. I'm like, what are we doing? I'll get better at it over time. But we decided we wanted to create a story together about winter because we're all winter people, and winter really is the defining season in the northern biome, or in this northern biome. And we also wanted to address the things that we can't easily see or visualize, such as time, temperature, carbon, methane, all these words that we're used to hearing but don't really have a visual for. And so that included creating work about permafrost, soils, microbes, and finding maybe some abstract language to be able to talk about these things. So we decided to create 10 paired paintings and poems. This progression here shows the development of the second painting in the series of 10. And it's showing the root system of a toppled tree and an underground slice of frozen soil, which is also called permafrost. And the progression, This is like this painting isn't even off the easel yet, actually. So it is a struggle for me to sort of articulate what's going on. But maybe I'll let Debbie's words do the work here. So this excerpt on the right is from her poetry, which is in progress right now as well. This is just a small part of that poem. But I'm just going to read it because I love these lines. Fungal threads seek sustenance in loosened soil. Deeper still, permafrost, layers host landscapes from millennia past. Time crawls. So we're really excited to continue working on this project together. I'm going to just show you three of the other paintings that are currently in progress, like still wet to the touch. But we're excited to share that this work will be on view. If you find yourself in Fairbanks this summer, it will be on view at the Museum of the North from probably about mid-June to mid-September. So if you find yourself in Fairbanks, we'd love for you to see this work and experience the whole story at the museum there. And I guess just as a closing thought, I think that for all three of us, this project has really been not just about celebrating our shared love for winter in the North, but sharing our fears and uncertainty about the changes that we see and experience here in Alaska every day. So this project is very close to home for all three of us. So before I hand things back off to Chris, I just wanted to share a few ways to keep in touch. I mentioned there's going to be that exhibit at Museum of the North in June to September of this summer here in Fairbanks. I'm using social media less and less, but I've been really good about keeping the current page on my website up to date. And I do strive to send 1 or 2 emails a year to keep in touch. So you can sign up for my email list there on my website. It's in the top right there. And oh, a short film about Rose, Rachel, and I making art at Denali Base Camp is going to be released this summer. Rachel's working on the final parts of this, so we don't have an exact date yet, but keep your eye out for that. I'll put it on my website and YouTube and all those places. Well, I actually don't know if I'm allowed to put it on YouTube. It's Rachel's work. Stay tuned. It will be somewhere. And yeah, I've started to do a lot more teaching, and unfortunately, all the classes are full for this summer. But if you're interested in visiting the Arctic, I've really been trying to offer a few classes every summer here in Alaska and actually in northern Norway as well. So please keep in touch. Your support means a lot to me, means a lot to any and all artists, and it means a lot to organizations like Alaska Wilderness League who are really doing this nitty-gritty work of protecting lands through advocacy and education and policy. So do keep in touch. And I'll just end by saying thank you again for being here today. All this work happens, with immense support from so many different people. And I'm grateful for you to be here and for Alaska Wilderness League and for Chris to host this and allow me to share this work with you all. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Claire. That was fantastic. I love seeing paintings that are still wet, so to speak, in the presentation, which is super great. For folks paying attention to the chat, Clara mentioned a couple links. I dropped in a direct link to her website as well as a link to the Museum of the North. I don't think information about that exhibit is yet up on there, but keep an eye on those things to keep abreast of kind of what she's been up to. Clara also mentioned all of the work that Alaska Wilderness League is doing on the advocacy standpoint. We're obviously seeing a lot in Congress right now through budget reconciliation discussions, which will impact the nation for a while. One thing we are doing is if you visit the main page of our website, we're encouraging everyone to reach your member of Congress, whether or not he or she is favorable or against our issues. We need to ensure that any Arctic drilling, particularly any Arctic National Wildlife Refuge drilling, is excluded from any bill package that is passed. We're doing a lot of work in DC, but we need folks to raise their voices as well in constituencies across the country. So do visit the website. And then I'll just mention that at the outset, I made mention to a storytelling grant that Alaska Wilderness League has been running now for about 3 years. That grant is made possible through donations to a memorial fund that was set up in honor of our late executive director, who used storytelling as a powerful tool for advocacy. If folks are able to consider and make something some sort of a meaningful commitment to that, any donations will go directly to the storytelling grant and have a huge impact in supporting the work of Klara and other storytellers. We will actually feature the most recent recipient, a woman named Elsa Sebastian, who's a filmmaker doing some incredible work in the Tongass at our next presentation in April. With that out of the way, there was a few questions in the chat I wanted to just raise for you, Klara. One of which was we saw that beautiful dog in some of the slides, which was great. But some people were curious if you encountered any other wildlife out in some of your adventures during your painting.
Yeah, definitely. Great question. Yes, definitely. Most most often it's birds. I'll admit that's the thing I see the most of. Certainly moose, caribou, porcupine, wolverine if I'm lucky. Um, yeah, because I'm sitting in one place and spending a lot of time being quiet and working, I think that I probably see more animals than I would see if I was just moving through a place because they hear me coming. I think it's rare. It's more rare for me to see an animal than for an animal to see me. And so by sitting in one place, I do get a chance to see a lot of animals. Yeah. And bears too. I mean, that's something I didn't talk about, but a lot of this is solo travel or with one other person. Bear safety is a huge thing in how I approach all of this. And um, I've never had any sort of bad encounter, and I certainly respect the space of bears, and I pay attention to their behaviors. And that is a common question that I get, but usually they're distant dots in the landscape that I watch through my binoculars.
No close encounters, which is good.
Yeah.
One other question, and I apologize to the person who asked this. I'm probably going to butcher the pronunciation of this, but there was a question about how you treat your canvas and whether you gesso it before you go out into the field. Did I say that word right?
Yeah, you sure did. Nailed it.
Fantastic.
Yeah, there's some artists in here.
Yeah.
So I used to use canvas, like raw canvas, and I would gesso it at home. I would stretch it first, gesso it, unstretch it, go outside, re-stretch it, paint, unstretch it, bring it back. That was a lot of steps already. So what I do now is I actually paint on pre-primed, clear gessoed linen. And so the reason I really like that is that well, for one, linen is much stronger than canvas, and having that pre-primed gesso just saves me a whole step of stretching and preparing the canvas to go outside. And I really like having the toned canvas, or toned linen, I should say. And because I paint so many snowy scenes, when I put white down on a toned linen, it actually shows that white much easier. It's like working on a toned paper, if any of you are familiar with that. So that's what I use. I should know the brand name. Frederick's. I usually order a giant roll, and it costs like $300 to ship to Alaska, and it's good for 7 years. So I'd have to look up the brand name, but yeah, it's clear gesso on linen canvas or on linen.
Yeah. And speaking of supplies, you talked about this a little bit with your oil painting or with use of oil and your shift away from acrylic. Is when you're painting in an Alaskan winter, which is not the nicest of conditions for those who haven't experienced it, how does that impact some of your other materials? Are brushes hardening, or what else is happening in that process?
Oh yeah, great question. Mostly I'm getting cold. The thing, I guess as far as like materials go, the brushes, I guess I'm working fast enough and I'm only working with maybe two or three brushes. And because I'm moving them, that kinetic energy, they stay warm enough to be workable. Um, they don't actually freeze. It can be problematic if it is snowing out and I get any snow in my brush because snow is water and it can kind of gum up the oil paint. In that case, I just have a couple of recycled old t-shirt rags and I will just clean it out as best I can. And sometimes actually the painting behind me right here, You probably can't see it very well, but sometimes you get these really strange effects. I painted this at 30 below Fahrenheit, and it was snowing, and the snow was landing on the canvas because I didn't have a tarp, but it made this really beautiful effect. So I just went with it. So um, it can complicate things. The key thing is that I'm eating food constantly. I am stomping my feet. I'm waving my hands. Like I'm drinking hot water. I'm doing good self-care. Like those are the most important things about painting outside in the winter, I think,
Hmm.
because it can very quickly get unfun otherwise. Hopefully that answers that question.
That's great. I can imagine it would could get unfun quick. I think one other one that popped up is, if you're painting indoors, obviously, and you're using oil-based paints, you're getting the fumes associated with that, perhaps. I'm assuming that's not much of an issue you're facing, or is it? Is it impacting some of the way that birds or anything is interacting with you?
No, so I use what's called Gamasol paint thinner. So it's an odorless mineral spirit. And um, gosh, I don't have a bottle laying around, but I use like less than this much solvent in a year and a half. I really don't need much. I use a tiny, tiny bit for like if I really get a brush that the paint dried in, I might use that in a rag, but I'm bringing like a very, very small amount into the field as a backup. I might not even use it. Mostly I use safflower oil or a walnut alkyd oil, so that's in a separate container. And that's great for cleaning brushes. I can get them back to the studio in good shape that way and use just basically, uh, wow, Dawn dish soap or, any other. It's just like a really basic, is it Castile soap to clean the
Yeah,
brushes? Um, so so yeah, I don't use very much solvent at all. And actually it's technically not a solvent. Gosh, we could get into really specific nerdy art stuff here, but yeah, I use Gamsol when I need it. I don't need very much, and so I don't encounter any issue with fumes inside or out.
great. Well, thank you for that and for all this. I'll share too. We did have a recording of this. I know I saw some people kind of joined a little late, so a link to this will go out within the next few days, as well as some links that were shared here to make sure that you folks can find Clara and her work. And hopefully you're headed through Fairbanks this summer and can have a chance to check out the series. I know our board will be out there, and I'm hoping to get them there too. So thank you again for being a part of this, and everyone have a wonderful evening, wonderful afternoon.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.